people might not agree with this, but I think the father's voice is the most important in the room because whatever he says goes. If a mom is like, I don't want a vaginal exam, no, thank you. And the nurse is like, well, the doctor says, we need to do a vaginal exam or you can't start pushing until we confirm that you're 10 centimeters. The father's saying, she said no. There's nothing anybody can do to override the father's voice in that moment. We talk a lot in doula work of like, you cannot speak for the mother. You cannot make decisions for the mother. You cannot speak to the hospital staff for the mother. But the father can. The father can speak for the mother, and he should, and he has to. He is in charge of that child. Nobody else is going to go home and feed and house and pay for and take care of that child other than the father and the mother. And so the father's voice is going to be listened to. Like nobody is going to mess with a man who is clear and confident and grounded and saying, she said no.
Getting pregnant and giving birth are two of the most exciting things you can ever hope to experience in this life. The moment you think you could be pregnant, you're frantically searching for all the best information, which is why you're here today. I'm Stephanie King, and with my many years of experience as a professional childbirth educator, doula, and lover of all things pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, I'm here to make preparing for your birth enjoyable, empowering, and totally easy. Each week, I'll cover different topics, interview professionals, and get into the nitty-gritty birth stories from mamas just like you. And when you're ready for more, you can join me in the My Essential Birth course at myessentialbirth.com, where I take you step by step through exactly how to prepare your mind, body, spirit, and partner for a birth you love. So let's get started. Welcome, you guys. This week, I have with me Catalina Clark. I know that you guys are going to love this episode. She is a midwife in Sonoma, California. I'm actually going to give her a chance to introduce herself in just a second. But today's topic, I think, and the different nuances of today's topic, I think have not been covered enough on this podcast. And I know that we're not talking about it enough within the birth world. So if you're here today, I am so excited. You're in the right place to learn all the things and to feel uplifted and strengthened and really have some autonomy and I guess just power over your body and your decisions. And that's what we're here for. That's what it's all about. So with that, Catalina, will you take a moment, say hello to everybody, kind of tell us a little bit about you. And then I want to go into a little bit about your background because I learned a little bit of that and why you are doing what you do today and all that stuff.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name's Catalina Clark. I am a home birth midwife in West Sonoma County, north about an hour from San Francisco. And I'm a mother to two. I have a son, he's almost 4 this month, and a 7.5-year-old daughter. And I began my journey into birth as a doula in New York City back in 2014. And then I continued on and moved back to California, where I am now to become a home birth midwife, a licensed midwife. And my journey spans between hospital births as a doula, home births, and then I also personally experienced free birth and wild pregnancy, and that really transformed my perspective of how I practice midwifery today within quote unquote the system as a licensed regulated midwife, as well as just a person who sees birth as an inherently sovereign act and that we all make sovereign choices and decisions when it comes to birth. And I really now see the perspective of how sovereignty can be achieved in any state or setting of birth, whether you're in the hospital or at home.
Yeah, I love that. Can you tell me a little bit about what first drew you to birth work? So I didn't do the math. Did you get into birth work before you had your children?
I did. So This was over about 11 years ago. I started as a doula before I was a mama. And what drew me to birth work, honestly, was that I experienced a loss through the choice to have an abortion. And it was a really difficult time for me to do that. And so a lot of my own healing process came through stepping into birth work. And the first birth I ever attended, I was in the hospital. It was a very long and arduous prodromal labor, that turned into an augmentation with many interventions. And although I was in this highly medicalized place, I had this feeling of like, I've been here before. It felt very comfortable for me to be in the birth space, although I was very new and made many mistakes and didn't know very much on a technical level, but on a spiritual and embodied level, I was like, I have done this before in some way in a past lifetime or something like that. And so that led me down the path to discover how I was meant to show up in the birth space differently, not as a medical provider, but more as a spiritual guide and anchor, and seeing birth as a state of consciousness rather than a medical procedure.
Yeah, which leads me to, like, you talk about spiritual midwifery. And I know I've read Ida Mae Gaskin's book, and I've read some, other articles and things on it. Like, what does that mean to you?
Well, it's funny. I had a astrologer once told me, like, you need to spiritualize your business more. Like, you're not a traditional in the sense of a medical type of midwife. And then I thought about it, and I think the truth is that all midwifery is spiritual midwifery. Like, we cannot separate our connection to spirit from the process of birth. So for me, I see birth as inherently a spiritual experience as much as it is a physical and physiologic, hormonal, emotional experience. It is inherently spiritual because we are connecting in with forces and beings and entities of consciousness that are far greater than our analytical minds can understand. And so spiritual midwifery to me means holding space for all of those things that I just said, while also being grounded in the realities of navigating the medical system. And I've seen it show up. I've learned over the last 11 years a lot of things. So when I entered the birth space, the hospital birth space in the beginning, it was like, I remember nurses and doctors just like literally laughing at us, like at the door, by posting signs that said like, this is a bubble of peace, and this is how we want to be spoken to and talked to and treated, and just being really literally laughed at, me and moms, and treated with disrespect. And so I learned how to not even need to use these words in the birth space, and how when families and doulas and providers come in with an energetic field of this awareness, how that actually shifts the landscape more, that our physical presence and how we come to birth. Birth is a space where we don't even need words really to express. Mothers are extremely psychic in the birth space because their minds are in altered states of consciousness, right? So they're operating in wavelengths that are able to communicate without words.
Yeah, I think that you explained that in a really neat way. Like we talk about kind of being in labor land, that's like the version of what you said, but you just went a lot deeper into it. And I know, like, when as doulas or people who are going to be within the birth space, that's something that we learn or should learn is whatever you have going on, you need to leave it at the door. Like when you walk into this space, who you are and where you're at and all of that, whatever you bring into this is going to be part of it. And so it's really important that what you bring is good and helpful, and that holding space and being present for mom. And it makes a big difference. And I do think that's really important. The other side of that is, as a midwife or any person in that birth space that's there to help, like you're talking about this communication that happens without words. It's why having such skilled, in tune people is so important. Because if you don't know what mom is saying without saying anything, naturally, intuitively what she needs, which was a big wake up call for me, because I assumed, the first birth that I attended, I just assumed I knew what she was going to need. I just knew it, and I didn't. And so it was a good thing that I had tools, to pull from my tool belt and all of that until I became a little bit more seasoned, and you really are part of that space. But I love how you shared that. It's so neat. Such a neat way to look at it.
Yeah. And I think we're also human beings, we're flawed and we're not perfect. And so also being in authenticity of who we are and where we're at and what our capacities are. And so those are my really like the three pillars of authentic midwifery is authenticity, transparency, and integrity. So also showing up with exactly where you're at and not trying to know something that we don't know or we can't know about birth, not trying to be a savior, not keeping someone in their victim role that I need to save them from the system or save them from their doctor or save them from their nurse or save them from the choice of where they chose to give birth. And so that's where I think this nuance comes in. And I don't think people should have to fight for the birth that they want. I think giving birth in the hospital system is sometimes feels like you're going into battle. And I had that mindset of like, we're going in to fight the system. And because of where I stand as a midwife, if I'm going into a hospital, it's because we're going there for something that we need or they don't have, we don't have at home and we need. And so I'm going in with this attitude of like graciousness for what we need. But also I see my role in the birth space in the hospital is I become a true advocate. So, and knowing how to be a patient advocate. And I didn't know that early on as a doula. I was very much just standing by, witnessing, enabling, kind of co-signing on what the hospital's policies, protocols, or things that they said that they need to do. And I learned very quickly how to advocate as well without taking a woman's power away and how showing them how they can empower themselves, because we can't actually empower anyone. Empowerment comes from within. So self-empowerment is really what I'm focused on when it comes to birth. And that means giving people true informed consent. And informed consent is kind of a tricky word because in the hospital system and sometimes within midwifery, it's kind of an illusion, right? Because if you don't have the choice to say no, then you don't actually have a choice. And that's actually not informed consent. And so this ability to say no and how to speak so that people will listen, how to speak so that the hospital will listen, and having that language of how to speak to providers and how to speak to mothers and fathers and how to teach them to speak so that they will get what they want.
Yeah, I would say that's a skill. Do you have an example of that you could share so that moms that are listening can kind of, relate to it?
Totally. I think the father's voice is the most important voice in the room. Actually, we think it's the mom's, but in the medical system and in just culture and society, women are not seen as being able to make decisions in labor, in duress, that they are hysterical, that they are not capable. And also they're in such a vulnerable state that it's really hard. We see this all the time. Mothers submitting because they just want to get the baby in their arms. They just want to have their baby, and they'll be willing to do anything that anyone says that's going to support them in getting their baby in their arms, especially when fear tactics are being used. People might not agree with this, but I think the father's voice is the most important in the room because whatever he says goes. So for example, if a mom is like, this is one example, I don't want a vaginal exam, no, thank you. And the nurse is like, well, the doctor says, we need to do a vaginal exam or you can't start pushing until we confirm that you're 10 centimeters. The father's saying, she said no. Like there's nothing anybody can do to override the father's voice in that moment. So we talk a lot in doula work of like, you cannot speak for the mother. You cannot make decisions for the mother. You cannot speak to the hospital staff for the mother. But the father can. The father can speak for the mother, and he should, and he has to, because he is the one who is, as my teacher says, like holding the charge for the birth, like legally, lawfully, spiritually, like he is in charge of that child. Nobody else is going to go home and feed and house and pay for and take care of that child other than the father and the mother. And so the father's voice is going to be listened to. Like nobody is going to mess with a man who is clear and confident and grounded and saying, she said no.
Yeah, that's huge. I feel like there's like a twofold thing there. Like one, dads, listen up. Like this is for you. That's it. Like that's going to be the post this week. Dads need to pay attention to this conversation. The other side of it is I know men are going to be like, but how do I know that I know more than the doctor? There's a big like, flashback of that. Now, if a doula is in the room or a midwife, such as yourself in the hospital setting where that provider can leave and we can have a conversation or you can say things out loud and kind of whatever. I think that can be helpful. But like, what are your recommendations? What are your suggestions here? I love how you said if mom said no and the doctor's like, well, we need this, that dad can step in. That's like a clear indicator. Nope, I'm going to stand up for what she just said. What does it look like when she's not saying?
That's a good question. I think it definitely is a conversation between the partner and the man because we have removed men's role in the birth so much, right? So men have become really like spectators and observers and on the sidelines. And I have seen this as well. Like it took me a long time to understand this for myself. And I saw relationships dissolve in the birth space because a man didn't stand up for his wife or wasn't in tune with what she wanted. And so being clear on what her birth vision is, her birth plan, for lack of a better word, and understanding that even if she's not speaking up, he remembers she didn't want the vaginal exams. He remembers that she wants an unmedicated birth, and he knows how to support and protect that space for her, regardless of if she's not saying a clear no.
Yeah, you're right. And I think communication is huge. That's like we've got to get that down before we head into that birth space. And honestly, just for being together in general, if you guys made this baby together, there's a lot of communicating that should be happening along the way, prior to birth and into mothering and fathering. So totally agree with that. Will you talk a little bit about birth sovereignty? How would you define that? What is that?
It's such an interesting question because I think there's been a lot of polarization in the conversation around birth sovereignty, and that if you engage in any sort of system that's not a sovereign birth, or if you have a midwife, or if you engage in the medical system, that you can't quantify that you've had a sovereign birth. But like I said, I believe birth to be a sovereign act inherently. And so sovereignty to me is like an inner state of inner serenity and safety. And it is a state of making decisions from your innermost truth and decision making. So anyone can make a sovereign decision when you have the awareness of all of the autonomous choices that are available to you in birth, and that everything is an option in the hospital. And so although it may not seem like it's an option, or it's not phrased as, or the provider is using, someone recently said to me, it's like they kind of have this like command voice, right? Like this rhetoric in a way that makes it feel like there is no choice and there is no option. But when you look back and you see the reality that every single thing is a choice. And so when we're choosing that is how we create sovereignty in any situation. And so it is the awareness, right? The consciousness from which we are choosing to engage. And so if we're just going along the steps and the system and we're not questioning anything and we're just doing everything we're told, that can be, you can still, right? So many people have positive birth experiences and they're like, we just did everything that the provider said and we ended up with a good experience, And of course that does happen. And I do think that there's a bit of luck involved in the stars, right? Of like the provider and the nurse and the birth and everything just really happened to go well. But in the sense of the hospital birthing system, right? The way the system is designed, we don't have a broken system. The system is actually designed in a way to control birth and to control people in a way that they're trying to avoid, right? Liability, saying they're avoiding complications, but creating complications and then fixing them. And so this word sovereignty to me really is actually being fully in relationship with yourself and your truth while being in relationship with others. So it doesn't mean isolating ourselves from systems and institutions and not getting birth certificates and not getting social security cards. Like it can mean that, and it means that to some people, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah. As you're talking about this, it makes me wonder, is there a way, as moms are getting information, especially during birth, and they are trying to gauge medical advice and decisions that they want to make, and also use their intuition. There's like this kind of like back and forth. Do you have some ideas on, or have you seen how this can be done well? Like, how can you tune into your intuition and get medical information and make the decision that's right for you? What does that look like?
I think in today's world, the medical information and the information overload in general, the medical information and the non-medical information that is out there in the world requires a very high level of discernment. Like we are in no lack of information right now. And the thing about medical information, studies, statistics, data on birth is that not a single study can be applied to an individual woman. So none of us are average. And the birth process, no matter how controlled a study might be, like, oh, we studied 1,000 women who went into spontaneous labor and we did this, that, and the other. Those are not good studies because a woman's birth cannot be quantified based on her age, how many weeks gestation, the size of her baby. We're not looking at the nervous system. We're not looking at the amount of stress that woman is under. We're not looking at her level of nourishment, her diet, her lifestyle, her history, her epigenetics. So all of these things combined are what create our birth outcomes. And so when we're talking about comparing medical data on births, and to make decisions from those, we can use that as information, but they cannot be applied to individuals. So I'm just going to say that there's really no such thing as a good study on birth. And everything is so bought and skewed towards the medical system that it's really hard to know, even in that, what is true. And that brings me to, right, like our intuition. So women today, families today are really suffering from what some people call like just instinct and intuition damage from the moments of our own births. So we are taught from the moment of our own birth that we need to be controlled and dominated, and we need anything outside of ourselves in order to be healthy. We need formula. We need vaccinations. We need testing. We need to be weighed and measured and checked at every turning point. And so we need to look outside of ourselves to tell us, like, yeah, we're growing well, we're developing well, and so this is really ingrained into us. And what I see actually is on the other side of the spectrum, right? The sovereign spectrum, the free birth spectrum, everything is a variation of normal. The hospital has nothing for you. That women are actually diverging from their own intuitions to seek support, right? And so we've gone so far onto both edges of this spectrum. And so everything that I'm talking about is really returning back to a self-directed approach to birth. So when it comes to childbirth education, childbirth preparation, researching, like everything has to be directed to what is true for you, what is true in your body, because that is the only thing that is true for your birth, for your pregnancy, for your parenting, it extends all the way, right, into sleep training and feeding, and all of these things are it's a continuation, right, of this divergence from ourselves and our intuition and our higher selves, and how really we don't need anything outside of ourselves in order to make decisions for ourselves. At the end of the day, we can take in all the information, but that decision has to come from within.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges actually is that there's so much information now. There's so much opinion. There's so much good and there's so much bad. And we look at all of it. And I think, social media or whatever, just being online all the time, that gives us all of those places coming at us all the time. And I know for myself, it makes me second guess, wait, is this what I should be doing for myself, for my family, for my body, or like that worked for that person. And, and it is really easy to end up all over the place. So I love that kind of like tuning in, coming back in, however you do that, however you get back to your own, journaling, meditation, whatever that looks like for you to kind of like tune into yourself. I always tell moms, if no one were in the room, what would it look like? And sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. But if there were no one around, no one judging you, no one looking at you, and you could make a decision, what would that look like? And oftentimes it's very different than the decision. You don't realize how much you're basing it off of your surroundings, the people you love, the information that you have received. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting process.
There's way, way, way too much information. And even in my midwifery practice, like I have strayed away from giving information to people who are not asking. So if they're not asking for the information, I don't want to implant another like mental load for a woman to just, unless it's something that I see coming up or I feel intuitively or I think it would be supportive, but just to I used to spit out all of the midwifery information that we need to tell women that they need to do this and eat this and, all the supplements and all the things. And I've really pared that back to what the woman is asking and needing. And so what do I think? It's hard for me to even say, like, what do I think women should do or how can they do this? Because it is a internal journey that nobody can tell you how to do. But things like being in nature, breath work, meditation, breath, movement, sound, like these elemental forces, right, of creation and of life, like our basic human elements that we are so detached from, and is the states of consciousness where birth happens. So we talked about it earlier, like labor land is not just some like woo-woo term, out there term. Like it is an actual place and it is a state of consciousness that we spend a lot of our time in. So every time we're sleeping and dreaming, our brainwave states slow down into some of the states that we experience in labor. And so brainwave states slow down sometimes so much so into delta states of consciousness. And those states of consciousness that is the state of consciousness of pure awareness. And it can be scary for people to be in those spaces and for men too, to see their women be in realms and dimensions that they've never witnessed before that feel out of control. So we don't have that need to control and fix and analyze and think our way through labor. And so people often say you can't think your way through labor, and that labor happens in the body, not in the mind. But I think it's important to know what is happening in the mind, right? And moving into our primal brain centers and out of our neocortexes, out of our thinking analytical brains. And that in order for labor to flow optimally, we need to be in those states as well. And so this preparation, for labor, I think more information, more methods, more pain-free labor, more childbirth education, Bradley method, like all of those things are great and they serve their purpose. But what I'm envisioning is really this quantum approach, this self-directed approach to birth, where everything comes back to finding your center and your truth. And that if that truth is having a C-section, that's fine. If that truth is having a home birth, that's fine too. But that it is coming back to centering women in the process, where right now what we have in the medical system and also in the midwifery system is a very provider focused approach.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you on that. I think giving women back their everything is so important. For us to be able to take back our bodies, our health, our minds, our decision making, and really make it our own. I mean, there's nothing better than that. And I think that we have strayed from that quite a bit. I actually love what you were saying about even spending time in nature and get outside of the box, get outside of the bad lighting, like go let the sun hit your skin and listen to the birds and be in the trees. And it's so funny because I swear the older I get, I just hit 40. Now I have some teenagers. I'm like, all I want to do is be in nature, and I've spent so much time, spending so much time in the box and doing all the things. And it is where you connect. It's where you can be calm. It's where that peace comes from. And I think, without those things, it's really hard to make an intuitive decision or to trust ourselves when those thoughts come up. So yeah, I really like that.
Something you said earlier was like about how women, making these decisions with all the information. And I can't tell you how many women have said to me, if it were up to me, I would give birth at home in my bathtub, but I have to give birth in the hospital. And I was like, well, who is it up to if it's not up to you? You know, it's like, this is the cultural context, the language, the permission, the programming, right? It's not anybody's fault. There's nothing wrong with them for making these decisions, but it really drives me kind of crazy when I hear these stories of like, if it were up to me, then I would have birth at home in my bathtub. Well, who else is it up to other than you? You know, who made you think that that decision was up to your partner or your mom or your grandma or your aunt or your doctor or the person in your life? Like, it's infuriating.
So what options do women actually have when it comes to birth settings and things? Like what for the mom that has only ever heard about going to the hospital with an OB and giving birth, you know, and that's just where you go and you come back with baby. What are the other options available to her? What can it look like?
Well, I'd like to say there's an infinite amount of options available to women in birth. And so, of course, you know, this is the dominant paradigm in this current history, right? It hasn't always been this way. We are all here because we were born outside of hospitals, our entire humanity, from, you know, just a couple hundred years ago. So this is like somewhat of a recent phenomenon. And you can give birth at a birth center, right? There are standalone birth centers outside of hospitals that are run by midwives. Sometimes they're connected to a hospital. Sometimes they're nearby for that person who wants that like field of safety of being closer by to a hospital or having something like this. There are some midwives who deliver in hospitals, but they're still pretty much under the guise of the protocols of the hospital system itself. Home birth midwives with regulated licensed midwives, which is different in every single state as far as how they can practice, what they can carry meds wise or order labs and do things like this. And so it's kind of like somewhere in between a medical provider. They are technically medical providers, home birth licensed midwives. And then there are traditional midwives, unlicensed midwives, sovereign midwives. So midwives who have been trained and experienced. There's often like this thing of thinking that unlicensed midwives are untrained or unexperienced, but that's also not true. They just have chosen not to go through the process of licensure. And in some states, that is actually legal. There is no licensure in some states. And there's also free birth. So a free birth technically would be defined as having a birth at home without any medical provider present, or even a doula, perhaps, just anybody who is non-medical. And also women can describe their births however they want. And so someone might say, I feel like I had a free birth in a hospital. And some people will go like, oh my God, that's not possible. But I think that anything is possible in birth in any setting. And that is the magic and the beauty of birth, is that it is such an unknown, mystical experience. And at the end of the day, no matter what choice a woman makes, like, we cannot control a birth outcome.
Yeah. Can I hit up just the midwife thing for a moment? Because I know moms are going to have questions about this. Will you kind of tell us maybe some common myths about midwives and home birth specifically, and what that actually looks like?
Common
what it could look like?
Yeah, you know, I live in like a culture, right, of midwives, where I'm surrounded by midwives and people who give birth with midwives, and it's just super normal. And then I go out into the world and I tell people I'm a midwife, and they look at me like, what's a midwife? Like, right. I cannot believe that people do not know what a midwife is, or they think it's called a midwife, or what's the difference between a doula and a midwife? And so I'm happy to share this. And it's shocking to me that it's still something that we have to like explain. Because midwifery, and I'll just go back to like a little bit of the history, right, is it has to be the oldest profession in the world, right? So who delivered the first baby was probably a mom and a dad. But what I believe is midwifery is its own spirit and its own consciousness. Like, it is understanding how to be with life and tend to life and death. So traditionally, midwives were the wise women in the communities. They came to the birth, they came to deaths as well. Some people call it like the womb to the tomb provider. And so the midwife was this community figure, community member who had experience in birth, wisdom in healing, and knew how to sit with birth and sit with the dying. And so over time, right, and through things like witch hunts and industrialization and colonization, right, this this wisdom that the midwife carried got kind of pushed underground. And so in the United States, there were areas like the Deep South, the granny midwives, right? So they continued to practice midwifery and they continued to service many, many, many babies, but they were positioned as unhygienic, untrained. And as hospital birth came on the scene and obstetricians, like midwives really got pushed out. And then there was this resurgence kind of in like the 60s and 70s, right? Ina May Gaskin, spiritual midwifery, like she's kind of the poster child of modern day midwifery, for better or less. And so midwives today have been, I'll just say it, co-opted by the state. So they are, the word midwife, someone is not legally allowed to call themselves a midwife in a lot of countries and a lot of states unless they are licensed by the state. So a licensed midwife is actually licensed by the medical board. They're licensed by the North American Registry of Midwives, NARM, and it is a like 3 to 4 year schooling process and traditional apprenticeship program where you learn under another midwife and you learn, you're basically licensed by the same board as obstetricians, but are licensed to practice autonomously. So we practice in the home birth setting, some practice in the birth center setting. We do not have to work with OBs. We do not have to be overseen by OBs. We are primary care providers for women in pregnancy, birth, and also postpartum and newborn primary care providers.
Yeah, I think all of that. And it's so interesting we're having this conversation because I literally just did an episode where I was like, I don't think you guys know the history of why things are the way that they are today. And so I went back to the 1900s when 95% of the births were out of hospital. And then we hit the 1950s and 90% of them were in the hospital. And the why, big marketing campaigns and hospital being a business and this smear campaign on all the midwives. And I mean, that's a big deal. That's stuff that we don't, I think, take into account a lot of the time. It's stuff that women don't know, just like they've never heard about a midwife. Well, why is that? There was a lot of money spent so that you wouldn't have to ever know that midwives existed, that there was another way. And I think that's really important to understand kind of how we got here and why we're here now, or why we're having to take back birth, or why we can't just trust our intuition anymore. There are systems in place still that create that. And so it is a problem. It's a big problem because it gets in the way of moms listening to their bodies and having the births of days that they desire, and the increase of intervention and complications and everything that we're doing today. It's just even watching what happened with 2020 and how women were treated and going from hospital to now home birth is actually safe in these settings. And there were just a lot that happened. I'm like, we are still evolving and it's still changing. It's, and there's a lot that's happening right now. And it's interesting to hear the history and where it's come from and why it's so important, to focus on these things now.
Yeah, I think it's quite a revolution and an evolution and a returning right back. And so I don't see us going backwards in history and returning to traditional midwifery in the sense of what it used to be. But now what's happening is actually we need to evolve to meet culture where we are, because one of my understandings is that women are reproducers of culture. So the birth culture that we have right now, that we've had for these last 100 years, like you're talking about, is what is shaping the overculture or the dominant paradigm of our society right now. And so I've written and studied a lot of, I don't know if you're familiar with the obstetrician Michel Audin. He was a French general surgeon, but he ran a birthing center in France, and he had incredible birth outcomes. And he wrote on physiologic birth. He wrote on birth in the age of plastics. He wrote on the industrialization of the world and how the industrialization of the world led to the industrialization of birth and the management of birth. And that he also writes a lot on Pitocin and the effects of Pitocin on the brain and on the body and on babies. And he did actually studies many years later to see how children who received Pitocin in labor, their levels of mental health, suicide, violent behaviors, all of these things have been studied and documented. We know that when we cut off the oxytocin receptors in the brain, because synthetic Pitocin goes directly into the bloodstream, and it cuts off the feedback loop of the oxytocin, natural oxytocin that is released in the brain. And the most amazing thing is that women who experience natural childbirth, who receive all of the oxytocin floods to their brain during and after birth, actually changes their brain structures, actually changes their personality. Dr. Sarah Buckley does research on this. And so how are we changing humanity's entire personality by flooding 40, 50% or more of women in labor with synthetic oxytocin? So that's just the inductions we know, right? At least 40 to 50% of women are being induced. Almost all women after birth, immediately after birth, are receiving a shot of Pitocin. So they're cutting off the moment after birth, right? That 1 hour, that golden hour. Women receive the most oxytocin in their entire lives at that moment of birth. It is the moment of bonding and connection and sealing the mother-baby relationship as their very first experience in the world together as two entirely new human beings. And so on a mass scale, we are severing our hormonal neurobiological imprint for love, bonding, and connection. And this is not to say that moms who receive Pitocin love their babies any less. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about evolutionarily, genetically imprinting and for lack of a better word, like dumbing down our ability to connect has severe consequences. And I think it is the root cause of what we're seeing today in the world. All of the violence, all of the separation, all of the conflict is because of this. And so birth to me, and we all want to heal the world. We all want to change the world. We all want to see something different. And so why I'm doing this, why I'm speaking out as a midwife who I feel a lot of fear about talking about this because of ancestral lineage trauma of like the witch hunts and things like this, right? Like nobody wants to hear this. Nobody wants to talk about this, and nobody wants to believe the midwife who's preaching about birth, because this is the root cause of trauma that I see that is shaping our culture today. And that the only way to heal it is through the moment of birth.
You talk about birth as a ceremony. What does that mean in practice?
So, yeah, like I said, the energy that I'm coming to birth with is really in a lot of reverence and respect for something that is greater than myself, right? So whether you relate to that as you're going to ceremony or you're going to church or you're going to meet God or something like this is what is happening at the moment of birth for me, you know? And so although I am a midwife and I have clinical tools, I rely mostly on my senses, right? What I can see, what I can smell, what I can hear. How do I know that a woman is close to having her baby? From the sounds that are coming out of her mouth, not through necessarily checking the cervix. And so really just being in reverence to the process of birth while also keeping my feet in like two worlds, you know, like I'm in that ceremonial space with her. And then I'm also having the broader lens of like a guardian who's kind of just watching over everything and tuning in with what might be supportive in that space as well.
Yeah. Is there a way that families can bring in intention or ritual or sacredness into the birth space?
Yeah. So there's so many ways, but one of the ways I'm really into right now is light and sound. And so light and sound are the two elements of creation. So what we know about the moment of conception is that the egg actually chooses the sperm. So if you didn't know that already, and you still think from your high school biology class that sperms are chasing and fighting to get into the egg, and they're the ones who the strongest one gets in. No, that's not true. The egg says, hello, you're the one, and they let you in. And the ovum makes a sound like a cricket, I imagine, if we were to know. But we know cell membranes rub together and they create sound. And this sound attracts the light from the sperm. So not only is there a light that is emitted at the moment of conception, the zinc spark, but the spiraling of the sperm tail has a bit of a light. And so the light and sound come together. And in this moment, there's another spark, right? The spark of life. And so what I've been thinking about a lot is how birth is the culmination of the sexual experience. So it is the sexual expression of life, just like the flower is the sexual expression of a plant. And so we've also very strongly desexualized and sanitized birth in order for it to be controlled and put into the hospital setting in this way. And so on a ceremonial level, so when we're in ceremony, when we're in ritual, we work with these, right? Like ancestral elements, the water, the fire, the air, the earth, and we bring these elements together just as these four core elements that make us human and that, we need for our survival. And so when it comes to the light and the sound, the father is responsible for the light and the mother is responsible for the sound. And so the sound of birth, right? The sounds that a woman makes in birth are summoning the light. And in the process of birth, the father is there to receive his light. And so it's his light that he put in there, and it's his light that he is going to receive. And the mother is birthing the light through sound. And so we talk a lot about surrendering to birth, but it's really, from my perspective, is like a summoning, like we're summoning the light. And so in Spanish, the word for birth is dar la luz, right? To give light. And so women and men, women are birthing the light. And so the masculine and feminine together in the ceremony, right, create the family. And so this is a ceremony that is, I think, the greatest, most powerful ceremony that we have on earth. And so if we are, and what ceremony, from the little bit that I understand about, traditional rituals and ceremony is to do things differently, is to bring about change. And so the intention that you set for your ceremony, and that's going to be different for everyone, right? The intention of their birth, but holding this intention of life as so sacred. And I think it is so precious. And this is what we have lost sight of all the nurses and hospital providers and parents who have had traumatic experiences in the hospital or just regular experiences in the hospital, is like not treating birth with humanity and reverence and respect of like, how are we speaking to women in birth? How are we handling babies after birth? How are we touching them? How are we speaking to them? How are we holding them? How are we separating from the mother when the only goal in the entire universe is to get mother and baby together?
I love that you shared that. As you were speaking, and I'm thinking about what it's like to give birth in a hospital, what it's like to give birth at home. Humanity that was the word. That's it exactly. Because I feel like in a hospital setting, it's very like policy, procedure, is mom and baby safe, right? That has to be and there's reasons for that, right? Litigation, and they don't want to lose their jobs, and they want to make sure that things are safe because they've learned such a medicalized thing. And you can have very incredible humanity can exist within that hospital setting. I've seen it, I've experienced it, I've been part of it. And it's always that conversation of what does the woman remember from her birth more than anything? How she was treated, how she was made to feel. And that's such an important note. I think if we can take just that word, humanity, and bring that with us into our provider's office, into our birth space, like, and kind of as a test of like, how does this feel? Does this feel like humanity is serving its purpose here? Do I feel heard? Do I feel loved? Do I feel supported? Never mind that there are things that need to happen that have nothing to do with that, And I think that does make a difference for how we give birth, but also how we walk into motherhood. how we're carried into motherhood. Are we supported and loved and nurtured and watched over into motherhood? And that affects our immediate postpartum and on to the rest of it, and our mental states and our emotional states. Those are big deals. And when you're talking about Pitocin, all these little things that we talk about, these interventions and this and that, it's not for nothing. There's a reason that it's a big conversation, and it's because it is all affecting us and who we are and who we become. And I think it's a bigger conversation than we really give it credit for. And maybe we come at it from the wrong angle. That's why I love the way that you speak about this, because it just brings it back to basics. It brings it back to who we are as women. And I just think that's such an important thing.
Thank you. My intention really is not to, spread more fear of the hospital, although I share things and people, women I work with, especially home birth mamas, they're like, this is exactly why I don't want to go to the hospital, and I understand that. And I too have seen miraculous things happen in a hospital setting with respectful care providers. So I don't want to say that that's not possible, but I think it has more to do with the family and the woman's state of consciousness and being in their power than actually the provider or the place or anything else. I think we are not in control of the birth outcomes, but we are in control of our state of beingness, our nervous systems, our ability to stay centered in ourselves when we are met with conflict, in the hospital and in that setting. And so I really don't want to bring more fear into this is why I don't want to go to the hospital. Although it's very valid, I think, and it's a natural adaptation, that people have had to the real trauma that has happened in the hospital, is to have this fear response of, I don't want to have anything to do with that because it's really real. And so if we can just come at it from this really biological, physiologic, quantum perspective of this is just how the universe works. This is how energy works. This is how particles and wavelengths and everything around us, that our brains are supercomputers that are creating realities based on our perceptions of what's around us, and that we actually have so much more control over ourselves than we are made to think when we're not handing over our authority. And I think, that just comes back to the whole conversation on sovereignty, and everything that I just spoke of is what creates inner self sovereignty that is not in opposition to anyone or anything. It's just standing firmly in one's own beliefs.
Yeah, I've seen that in real time. I've seen that in all of the settings like you were discussing. I've seen people who otherwise, with that same provider, with those same nurses, would have had a very different experience. But because they were able to stand in their own place and for their own options and choices and trust their intuition, that it went a completely different route. I think it's important, though, for women to hear, as much as I would love to have every woman be that, I don't think we all are. And that's why it's so important, when we're having these conversations and we're talking about these settings, to set that up so that it does support you. Because not every woman is going to be comfortable, able, in that vulnerable space to have that kind of birth that she wants without that outside support. Even knowing the communication and relationship that you have with your birth partner or your spouse, is he going to be able to advocate me? No. Well, if we can't advocate, I need to bring in a doula, right? I think that's why these conversations are so important. But truly, I think if we could get to that place where women can trust themselves, listen to their intuition, stand strong in their beliefs, have that sovereignty like you're talking about, then it really wouldn't matter where you are or what you're doing or who's there, and you could have exactly what you're looking for. So that's pretty powerful. Okay, I have a couple kind of rapid fire questions for you here at the end. I don't know how rapid this one will be. You tell me. But okay. I've been wondering, what would you say to a woman who says she's afraid of birth?
That's a really hard rapid fire one.
I know. I was like, wait, maybe that's not the rapid fire, but it is.
Well, I think fear is normal, right? I actually think that it's healthy to have fear. I think there's nothing wrong with having fear. My perspective on fear is go into the fear. Are you afraid of having a hemorrhage? Are you afraid of your baby dying? Try it on. what would happen if it did? Like, go all the way there. How would you feel? What decisions would you make? How would you handle the situation? Like, actually let yourself experience the fear all the way to the depths of the fear. Like, imagine yourself dying and bleeding from a hemorrhage. Imagine this thing actually happening, which is actually so much of the opposite of the advice that most folks would give. But what happens when we approach our fears with like, well, what if this happened? How would I handle it? What would I do? Would I make a different decision about where I give birth? Would it change my mind on giving birth at a home or a hospital? Like, if we actually see the fear all the way through, instead of holding on to that fear throughout the experience and then letting it go, like trying it on, deciding what you would do in that situation. I did that when I had a free birth. I was like, what if my baby dies? What will I do? How will I handle it? When will I call 911? When will I tell my partner? How will we bury the baby's body? Like, I literally made all of those decisions and I was clear of like, okay, if this happens, this is what I'll do. If my greatest fear happens, I feel confident in the decisions that I've made.
That's interesting. My third birth was a home birth. And my first home birth, like the only one I had unmedicated at a cesarean. I had a medicated VBAC and then a home birth. And there was a point there, I had been pushing for like 4 hours, mental block, right? Like, I haven't done this before. There's a lot of emotions. There's reasons that I was pushing that long. And I wasn't really pushing. It was like where you breathe through your nose, you know? You're like, I don't really want to lean into that sensation yet. And there was a period where I'm like, if I can't do this here, what does it look like? And I literally mentally visualized, I had to walk myself through all of the things. And I've shared this before, like, okay, we're going to have to call an ambulance. There's going to be people in this room, like loud. They're, judgmental potentially. Like, it's going to be a completely different vibe. The lights are going to be on, transfer to there, get to the hospital. What's that going to be like to have to deal with the hospital staff? And they already told me not to do a home birth and, all of this, right? And it was in that visualization of it and getting to the end of it where I'm like, I can't do this. That is not what I want. And that's when I leaned in to my creator, my God. And I was like, Heavenly Father, I can't do this. I need help. And it was shortly after my baby was born in 2 pushes. And so I think that's a really neat thing. It's interesting because I tell moms, we have like our gentle cesarean birth plan and stuff. And the idea behind it being like, look over it, see what you like, see what you don't like, mark it all up, put it away. That way, it's there. But I love the idea of bringing yourself through the entire experience and making the decisions, because it's less scary when you can see yourself making decisions than leaving it up there to do whatever it does and float around and then not decide. I think that's so much less scary. Even in life, like, I want to know what's happening. Tell me what the procedure is going to be and all of this, that, what is happening, and then I can deal with it. But if there's a lot of like unknowns or I don't know the next step, then it's scarier. So that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. And the plan, the decision can change, of course, but having that framework in mind, and also just like when you're going through those steps, if someone comes to a place of like, oh, I'm actually not up for taking this responsibility, I do want to go to the hospital and outsource this because this is just way too much for me and I cannot handle it. That is okay too. And that's how we arrive at those places. But if we don't explore and investigate like what is really true and what we're really up for and where our capacity is at to hold what level of responsibility that we are willing to take. And so again, I think people are swayed too far onto either side without that internal investigation happening.
Totally. Okay. What do you wish every mom knew about birth? Like, if you could say this to all the mamas that are listening, what do you wish you could say to them?
I think birth is not designed to be inherently painful, actually. So the pain receptors in the uterus are actually, we don't have nerve pain receptors in the uterus, right? We feel cramps, we feel tugging, we feel pulling, we feel sensation, but it's not like the nerves on our hands and our feet and our skin where if we, get a burn or hurt, right? Or a broken bone or something, it's just like extreme pain. The systems of our reproduction and birth are actually not inherently designed to be painful when we are in the right set and setting. And I think pain, right, societally, culturally is like the number one reason for going to the hospital and getting an epidural, right? Everyone is afraid of the pain of birth. And that, I'm not saying that it's not intense. I'm not saying that it's not absolutely crazy compared to anything you've ever experienced in your life, but it is not designed to be excruciatingly painful for days on end. And so we see a lot of protracted labors. We see a lot of long, difficult labors, right? Malpositions, things like this, right? And these are symptoms of sedentary lifestyle, health, metabolic health, movement patterns, injuries. The way that we move as human beings has changed. And now the way that we birth, we're seeing these high rates of like much more complicated, painful births. But this is actually not the way in which birth is designed physiologically.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, here's your quicker questions, and these are just for fun. What do you think is one book every pregnant mama should read, if you could give one book?
Birth Reborn by Michelle O'Donnell.
Okay. And one thing every woman should do during their pregnancy?
Walk.
One thing that they can avoid during their pregnancy, should avoid?
Processed foods.
I love it. I support this. Yeah. Okay. One mindset shift that changes birth.
There's only love in there. There's nothing to fear. There's only love in there.
I love it. Catalina, this has been lovely. Wonderful. I'm so excited that women...
Let's change it. Let's change the mindset shift because I have a better one.
Okay. We're going to go back.
What if this is not a problem? That is my number one question to ask myself and my mamas who work with me, who bring something to me. I always say the first thing to think about, what if this is not a problem? Let's not make this a problem.
I love that. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited for moms to be able to dive in and listen to this conversation. I feel like I'll be excited to listen to it again, just pop it in my ear and kind of have it going. You have such a neat take on birth and kind of the convergence of, like you were talking about, like meeting in the middle, like not going to medical, not going to on the other side of things, and trusting ourselves. And I think it's been such an excellent conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such an honor to be here. And it was really fun to just speak really openly about this as well. So I appreciate it so much.
If you loved what you heard today, the very best way to support this podcast and help other moms to find it is to leave a quick review. I read one at the beginning of the episodes, and I would love for yours to be next. And if you're ready for even more pregnancy, birth, and postpartum goodness, come join me in the My Essential Birth course at myessentialbirth.com, where I will hold your hand and walk you through pregnancy and birth step by step so you're totally prepared for a birth you'll love. See you next week.